ready for my epic intro? I
Yep.
spent way too much time on this intro, and I should have spent the time on the actual questions probably. But here we go. So today we have someone very special. Some call him a shaman. Some call him a superhero. A man I am happy to call Siim. A good friend and an expert on the topic of influencer partnerships from a pretty interesting angle. So, welcome, Siim. Thanks for coming. And I give you a chance to correct my intro here if you like. But um, Siim cut his teeth at StatSit, a company that specialized in deriving insights from social uh, for companies like Samsung, McDonald's, Exxon, Pepsi, all of the big fellas. Then spent 4 years on Brand Hero, publishing all kinds of interesting insights on creator partnerships, specifically in Asia Pacific, and with specific interests in topics like TikTok. I think based on what I saw of your more recent writing, at least, and currently going into your fifth year at Google, which is a loyalty that I admire. And is the course instructor for CXL's data-driven influencer marketing. Thanks for agreeing to this after much harassment, Siim.
Happy to be here. Thank you for visiting my LinkedIn profile.
You're welcome. Yeah, I don't think I know anyone who's been like adjacent to this space for quite as long as you have. I mean, I know StatSid was kind of one step out of influencer partnerships, but really into like organic social and social insights before anybody thought it was cool, right?
It's been a while. Although I do have to say I was very fortunate. One of the guys that I was really learned a lot from was doing in 1998 when I was still in high school. He was doing scanning forums to understand public policy perception, fed that to the UN secretary at that time, which was Kofi Annan. So I've learned from people that have come way before me. So I do stand on the shoulders of giants, to say, so to say.
Nice. The shoulders of forum sentiment analysis giants. It's awesome.
Exactly.
It's so cool to hear how people like get into their little rivet of the world, and it's such a I don't know. There's always some like very obscure random person doing it, not so random maybe to them, but like a person that you would otherwise never hear of that really impacted somebody's life in a way that sent them in a direction. I think it's really interesting. But so since we're on time here, uh, I don't want to go over. I want to give you your day back. So I start with an
One, one,
easy
one, one,
question.
one.
Where have you spent most of your time in recent years related to creator partnerships and influencers in general?
So first and foremost, I do represent my personal opinion, not my employer. That's important to be said. But I think I mean, influencers started, or that thread, I think, started really early on. Ever since I remember I got into this industry, but it just was a little bit different before, um, especially about YouTube bloggers to begin with. Then it was YouTube, and then the latest evolution was Instagram, and then the latest one was, I suppose, with TikTok. So it really came from the platforms advocating for those people, everybody, basically, to express themselves in all sorts of different ways, which a lot of people benefited from, I suppose. Um, so my most perhaps most important part of my contribution to all the marketers doing the hard work has been to try to measure what actually matters, with those partnerships, and how do you get to good outcomes, because guess what, all the marketers get budgets on certain terms, and they need to report back on those terms, and be able to report on sales numbers, or whether those are brand numbers, whatever those might be. And influencers or creators is just like one vehicle to help them to achieve those objectives. So that's been pretty much my focus for the past, I would say, like 12 years or so.
So really into the analysis bit and ROI measurement kind of at the end of the day, yeah.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
that's fair to say.
So what have you learned then in these last 4 or 5 years? I mean, Brand Hero was pretty heavily focused around social and influencers, and then your time at Google, and I think we've had some side conversations on the topic. So I'm curious, what do you think are the big learnings from the last couple of years for you? Any breakthrough epiphanies?
Yeah, I think the big one initially was like the enormous amount of Kool-Aid that we drink as marketers to jump on something new straight away without actually even questioning it too much. And I could go deep into like why that happens, but I think the reality is just that the value that you put into those partnerships versus the effort that you put into those partnerships versus the value that you get out is just um, lopsided. So and this is where I started writing a lot. I started blogging, and then that became like an online course that I then launched under this name called Data Driven Influencer Marketing and Brand Hero. So it was really came from pain and seeing not just my own pain, but pain seeing a lot of money being wasted. And again, I can't tell names or specifics, but it was very frequent. It's almost like every other campaign had an element of influencers in it. And then when you start investigating a little bit, let's say, did the creative do any better, A or B, very objectively, or what was the effort that we put into it? What was the budget that we put into it? How many times did we brief these folks, etc.? Then you very quickly realize that actually you need to put a lot of effort into it because these are effectively, most of them are new relationships entirely. They might have, some, if you're a consumer brand, you might have the privilege that some people are familiar with your product or maybe even of your brand for some reason, right? But they definitely don't know the ins and outs of it or the way you craft your marketing messages. So there's a lot of onboarding that needs to happen from a moment that, here's a potential partnership we figured out, and then out comes something that you can actually use in your campaign. Um, so that was very quick to realize. So when you convert it into metrics, then I saw that cost per engagement usually was a green, meaning that it was usually better than, for example, buying that same thing if you compare with paid social. Because if you put all different tactics or approaches marketers can use next to each other, then that was a common denominator that you'd see that driving engagement specifically was more cost efficient. However, marketing to a very broad, like to a very large degree, is a game of reach and frequency. And unless you do have reach and frequency, then you're basically just fooling yourself, or you're doing a pilot. That could also be the case. So that was kind of where I think my original thesis started from, is that we've approached these partnerships in a very weird way. And it also, by the way, results in a very weird conversation for the influencers, right? Because if a marketer approaches you and says, "Hey, I'm responsible for 500,000 sales. Please help me to get it, and I'll pay you $1,000." It's absolutely bonkers. Like, how could you even do that? But that was real, and it still happens um, to a very large and surprising degree. So marketers almost like taking a step back and saying, "Okay, I can be lazy here, forget about everything that I know about marketing, and just offload this wonderful task to these influencers who seemingly have figured it out." But in reality, what they figured out is content. That doesn't yet mean they figured out marketing. That doesn't mean that they figured out your brand or your business. So I think that's kind of the primary thesis, so to say, that I started crafting the online course, and also better kind of approaches just to how to make these relationships work.
Gotcha. Okay. Huh. A lot to unpack in there. It's always fun to talk to you because I feel like every paragraph is like 9 points that I can 9 threads to pull on. Um, okay, so all of this thinking, I guess, then is pretty in relation to not necessarily Google, but large consumer companies, just to set the playing field a little bit, like very large scale, I would say, because I think you think about this channel much differently as a, I know you have Suma, for example, the your new ecom project, and I guess in Suma you think about this kind of thing a little bit differently when it's a very small company versus one of the largest in the world.
Some ways, I think so. But actually, regardless of the size of your company, I still believe that I mean, it comes back to the question of like, what's the purpose of it? Like, what's the value of it? And I think that of engaging folks like creators, the very important part that I learned over the years is that what these people have done is almost like superhuman, right? Like they've defied the laws of gravity because the platforms themselves are all pay to play.
Hmm.
Unless you pay, you're not going to get reach, right? The only way around it is to be exceptionally good with content, just exceptionally good, better than millions of others. So that's the baseline. Incredible, what an achievement in itself. Um, that being said, it is not the same once you throw a creative brief, a marketing creative brief in there, it muddies the waters quite a bit. And I think it confuses a lot of influencers as well. They're like, oh, hold on, now there's another stakeholder I need to somehow, take into account. It's not anymore me and my audience.
Hmm.
And that creates, I mean, in some ways, of course, you could argue, how good of a relationship that is, but nevertheless, it is necessary today because like 80 to 90%, like based on the data that I've seen, their income comes from these brand relationships. So they do have to make it work, and we have to make it work. And my point of view in that realm, of taking all these signals in, is that it's really about the creativity, and
Hmm.
we have to go back into our core of being a marketer that has to figure out how do we get that reach and frequency that we do necessarily need to report on, and that we know that eventually will lead into either good brand outcomes or good direct response outcomes, whatever
Hmm.
is your objective at that moment of time. So I think it's really about like making sure that everybody does what they're supposed to do and what they're actually good at, what their strengths are. I think that's what I kind of usually say.
Interesting. Okay. And one thing I think is cool about your thesis on creative excellence is how you coined it to me once before, and that stuck with me. I think you're only being proven more and more correct as all of the platforms themselves shift from the follower graph to the content graph. And this is really important, I think, for marketing folks just to understand the platforms themselves. So where it used to be maybe the publisher's followers or who saw the content, increasingly it's that the content that works is given to people who will consume it. And yeah, a lot of people give. I think TikTok really accelerated this push because then everyone tried to chase TikTok. But actually, YouTube was kind of already doing this a few years back with the recommended page, and there was even, I remember, lots of controversy amongst YouTubers as this shift kind of quietly happened a few years back. But yeah, any thoughts or ideas how kind of that shift then exacerbates this problem, or how marketers should think about that little shift? Have you thought much about it?
Yeah, I've definitely put some thought into it in the past. I think I was probably in the camp of marketers initially who was quite really disappointed around 2012 or so. I think when we had a big shift in Facebook's organic reach, just dropping like a bomb. Um, because remember, the time before that, the whole thing was like, build your community. It's yours, you
Hmm.
know. Build your community on Facebook, and it is your brand community. Now you can have this two-way conversation. It was all about that.
Hmm.
And then in a very short amount of time, it was like, yeah, but here's an asterisk. And that asterisk is like, in order to have access to that community, you're going to pay us. And by the way, that payment needs to be, and that payment needs to be, by the way, relatively high. So you build your own community, you invest millions and millions. Big brands spend a ton of money on just building these communities. And then overnight, in order to access those same things that we put so much effort into, now you had to pay. So I think a lot of folks felt a lot of marketers, not talking of myself, even I was a service provider at that time. I just saw that there was this sort of like, oh my God, we spent like years and years of working on our Facebook page. And then in effect, what happened to it is really, I mean, yeah, scam maybe is a strong word, but like, I think that was what was on people's minds.
Hmm.
So from there, I think came also the realization, and maybe it was a bit of a more sobering effect to the industry that perhaps was necessary. Um, and from there, I think people started kind of realizing more that like what is the purpose here, or where these
Mhm.
things are going to go. And it was clear at that time then that pretty much like you want reach and frequency, sure, you can have it anytime. It doesn't matter how big your page is, you just need to pay for it, and that's it.
Yeah,
And so the shift really started from much earlier, as far as I see, at least.
fair enough. Um, so to really boil down then your learnings and thinking, you're like the philosopher of influencer marketing. I think that should be your
God.
LinkedIn sub headline. Yeah.
Terrible.
Yeah, or the god of influencer marketing, if that's what you prefer. um,
No, yeah.
no, but I'm curious. So if we had to distill some of these learnings over the last years, then last decade really of thinking about this problem or set of problems, um, if you walked into a room full of the top 100 consumer brands, it's Honda and Apple and Tesla and Louis Vuitton, and you had a couple minutes to try to drill into their heads how to be successful. These like giants who I think you're particularly familiar with. Um, if you really had to give them a few lines on how to do this properly, what are the things you would choose to tell them? Because I'm sure you could tell them a lot, but I wonder what the real essence of it is. Feel free to take a sec if you want to think about it.
Yeah, that would be a wonderful opportunity to scold some of them. A lot of Yeah, I mean, I think the most important factor actually that also defines to a large degree whether this is a good idea or not is creative freedom, and we and meaning that whatever the stuff that I have to say will probably have a certain degree of freedom that I can express. We get a lot of stuff from global, for example. There's specific expectations in terms of like how you can adapt it to your local market. Same thing with regional stuff, um, and and especially this applies to pretty much every other global company.
Hmm.
And the other aspect here is that looking internally and doing a bit of soul seeking and asking yourself, well, how open are we with our creative treatment, right? How experimental are we? And and I would like to think I would think that generally speaking, you will not find great success with influencer marketing if you're not able to stretch those boundaries quite
Mm.
significantly. That's my current observation, at least from the past few years, because it's pretty clear that people hate ads. I mean,
Hmm.
it's not a secret. Like everybody knows that, and I think the behavior also of just swiping, like what we've seen with TikTok's playbook has been, is to almost like create this sort of addictive behavior of things. Like it just all shows that unless it has an element of entertainment plus perhaps education, then you're not going to have the earned right as a
Hmm.
marketer to deliver anything. People
Yeah.
are not going to pay attention, and and I think that's really what it comes down to, is having that humbleness and saying like, well, if that's the formula, education mixed with or sprinkled with entertainment, if you're not able to deliver that in a very like in a good way, then I think it's probably influencer market is probably not for you. You're probably not ready for it. um I think that's my first opinion of it. But generally speaking, it's in any case, whatever those companies decide to do today, it is still anyway the path of the future, because it is inevitable. What's happening is that a lot of more and more people are increasingly, turning off. It's not like messages or signals or marketing will stop in any sort of way, but it's easier to ignore it than ever in some ways. And we're just adjusted to it. Like every new channel or format that comes, like they will have some novelty in the beginning, and they will start quickly kind of like leveling out. Every time it's pretty much the same. So influencers, the good thing about it is that these are actually people that are really motivated to figure out and to keep up with times all the time. But the way at which we're engaging them, I think, is not particularly healthy. So I think right now, when you ask me, like, one thing is to talk about the past, but I think what works in the future. I think the future is much more collaborative, much more kind of like tapping into the hive mind of like what should be done. And within that spectrum, you definitely need to be open minded as a brand manager that things might get treatment that you've never seen before and might be completely bonkers. I mean, people talk about Duolingo, for example, as a good case of like social, but that's, to me, that's like the far end extreme. Like it barely never happens. This case never
Mhm.
happens. Like it's almost like one extremely talented girl that obviously was very skilled in many different ways. But I think what's more remarkable to me is like the freedom that she has had. It is
Mm.
absolutely unprecedented. You go to a slightly more traditional company. I'm not even talking like very edgy. Then you're not going to have this sort of opportunity, and that's probably where 99% of economic output is produced, and marketers are sitting. So I think, yeah, it's finding more ways definitely to tap into those thoughts and processes, and those folks that have it figured out, and embracing the brave new world.
Man, it's so much fun to talk to you because I feel like you always remind me of all of the tailwinds and all of the things that are converging in this space. Like, um, there's so much happening that's going to unlock a lot of what you're talking about. I mean, for one, a lot of smaller companies who are willing to be less devolved into the ultra repetitive kind of family friendly is the most important kind of formats, which I think is what you're talking about, is that the brand guidelines become such a restriction that you just can't actually produce creative. um, that's, I think, is that a fair summary of that one point at least? Yeah. Then I think what will happen is the smaller companies will come through who are basically like marketing teams inside of them are like production businesses. Basically they produce content at scale, and they understand content and they understand creators because they grew up scrolling TikTok. And I think um, those new companies are going to teach the big old ones a lesson for sure. I think the creator professionalization, like the capability for creators to have meaningful conversations with brands, we're still not there yet. There's a story I like to tell sometimes about how in Europe right now, if you offer a creator 10,000 euros to post something on Instagram or the opportunity to go to the pub with their friends, they might choose the pub because they're just not in that they're just not in that headspace of like the entrepreneurial hustle. They're still just purely creatives, and I think this will change, especially in Europe over the next years, as kind of I think a lot of the learnings from Asia and then kind of the grind set mindset of the US will flood into Europe as well. That kind of like hustle mentality. So yeah, it's so much fun to talk to you because I just start to see all of the stars aligning to kind of break some of the problems you're talking about. But do you have any ideas then for those bigger companies how do they protect themselves from like creative obsolescence? Maybe how do they manage to actually get through the fear of being too edgy or too like outside of brand guidelines or that kind of thing? Because my experience is typically that their expectations, what they fear is so far on the end of the bell curve that it's basically impossible. They fear like the worst possible thing, when really the worst thing that could happen is the link in the description is mistyped or something. So I'm really curious if you have any argument. If I was on the other side of that talk you just gave, and I said, yeah, well, we don't want these creators saying bad things about us or talking about politics in the video, so how are we supposed to be creative? Like, what's your
Mm.
counter to this? Or am I getting the problem wrong a little bit, maybe?
No, the problem is very pointy. I mean, the way at which I mean, obviously, I'm bit biased from my own standpoint, right? Like I look at it from as a measurement challenge and perhaps as a
Yeah.
marketing effectiveness challenge. Um, I mean, my answer to these things is always like, what are you gunning for? Are you looking for 100% increase in in your budget delivering? Are you looking for 50% increase? Like what are you trying to get from here? What's a good outcome for your brand in terms of a specific attribute being lifted? How much of that budget should be assigned to that? So it gets a bit technical, I suppose, but in the end of the day, what it comes down to is to say that, you know, you can probably achieve marginal results, or let's say average results, with a checklist. You get eventually into a checklist where you say that, you know, all of our creative needs to follow these rules. Here's the rules. From there, from what I've seen, you will probably add another 20 to 30% of being more effective when you add a committee to it. Here's a committee. Here's with the checklist, and here's a committee. Committee being the poor folks who think that they've understood social are probably older than I am or me, and pretend most of the time, and then we're, you know, collectively, and perhaps a few agency folks, and then collectively we'll probably get to, I don't know, think of it as a grade from 0 to 100. Let's say we'll get to 60%, right? But if you ask yourself, what's a slam dunk, what's a Mr. Beast level of creative, you know, then I think it's very clear. It's very clear you're not going to achieve it with a checklist. You're not going to achieve it with a committee. So where does creativity come from that is of that level, high grade? My answer to it is like it is a fairly chaotic process that needs to
Mm.
be very carefully protected within the company, and it's definitely not a group exercise. And so there's a certain, I would say, number of terms and conditions that need to be applied, and I would probably start from like asking those sort of like questions, like which level of improvement are we talking about? Are we talking of marginal improvement? We can just slap some rules on it and say,
Mhm.
for example, you know, you introduce a creative testing program that can already lift probably your effectiveness by a certain degree. Like we can already test a ton of stuff using AI these days. This is not something special to Google or anything like that. It's available to everybody. It's been a big revolution, I think, in the marketing industry in the past 5 years or so. Right? You slap on that service, your effectiveness will probably increase. I can tell you that much.
Hmm.
You know, so when you look at it from those perspectives, then I think like it needs to be a very honest discussion between CMO, finance, and then whoever else is in that conundrum,
Mhm.
and then just ask like, how far do we want to go? Like, how far are we ready to go? I think those are the interesting questions from there. Um, of course, what's the tricky part here is that, you know, I'm making it is fairly abstract what I'm talking about, but the tricky part is that the goalpost also keeps on changing all the time. The environment keeps on changing, and the fact that
Yeah.
Mr. Beast came up with an amazing idea in the past month, even he knows that, god damn it, he needs to be better than he himself next month,
Yeah.
because that's what people will expect, that instead of spending 10 millions on a video, now he needs to spend 12 or god knows how much. So that's maybe the fun part, or the ambiguous wild card that we all need to also attest to, and yeah, it makes the whole space exciting, but it certainly requires a very, you know, delicate treatment of creativity the higher up you go in that sort of, you know, expectation, um, because we all like pick the world's best examples of creativity, any field, right? And you will probably quickly realize that not a democratic situation, um, fairly ambiguous, usually usually quite coincidental. Sometimes has to do a bit with data, but I would say data in that situation is also could actually be an inhibiting factor. It's more of a guiding principle that, okay, this is kind of the area you want to look at, but the real creativity is not unleashed by the data itself. It's about what can future be, how can,
Mhm.
you know, what are the things that we haven't thought of, and really zooming in into the user, right, and their reality, and what is it that they actually want but they're not telling us, or they're not able to express it to us. in a way that everybody is kind of thinking. So those are the things that, like, it gets into that territory where um, it's probably a creative director is much better to answer. But from an effectiveness standpoint, right? I know 100% that tools, checklists, committees, that sort of thing will only go this far. And
Hmm.
then from there, you've got this X factor that you can only unlock with a very specific treatment and terms and conditions. Probably Apple is a good case of that in the commercial space. You know, when you think about like their creativity and the way how Nike is another one that obviously, you know, well known. You look at how what they've done with the brand and how, you know, they've taken a principle stance and sometimes
Hmm.
and stay true to the brand. All these sort of things, they're not, you know, democratic decisions. And
Yeah,
that's the thing. And probably not a tool was involved in making those decisions as well, or not a checklist or not a committee. So those are some of the learnings that I've had maybe over the past years. Um, so yeah, but you know, getting finance involved, getting measurement involved, getting the CMO involved. I mean, those are the things that need to happen eventually.
totally agree with you. I think to summarize this, then, from the you know, you said you'd probably get a better answer from a creative director, but I think it means something more. And I think you were really succinct. You know, it's not creative for the sake of creative, it's creative for the sake of necessity. It's absolutely what you need to be producing. So I think yeah, really, really well said. I think we could do a whole other 30, 40 minutes probably on measurement itself. I would have liked to hear you nerd out over the details, but I know you got to run. So maybe to summarize what you've said so far in a few words, then pursue creative excellence, protect that creative excellence. If you manage to find a nugget of it, then make sure you protect whatever entity it came from. Maybe we need to introduce jesters back into creative teams. You know, the ones you can't judge or condemn. I think this is that's maybe what these teams need. Anything else you want to say, Siim, before we wrap? And thank you so much, by the way.
And yeah, thank you so much. That was a good wrap up. Have fun, you know, enjoy the process. I think we've forgotten also to a large degree why I think a lot of us started in marketing, which is to enjoy it, you know. Also, studies, by the way, show, of course, I had to mention it, that humor is in decline in terms of advertising generally. So lean into it. I think people want to have see more fun and more lighthearted things, and that's really, if there's one thing to say, there's more experimentation will probably lead to better outcomes. That's the only formula that I think is pretty tight. Is one thing we know, that it's change that keeps on giving.
Yeah.
So yeah, enjoy.
That's awesome advice. I think this ties really well. You know, the experiments are where learnings come from. It ties back to what you said before about how you have to kind of break out of the normal internal guidelines and this kind of thing. I think when you run a good experiment, I hope you'd agree with me. The exponential outcomes come from like very intense experimentations. You know, you don't get nuclear fusion by like rubbing two rocks together. You really have to do things that are intense and crazy. So and that might feel even uncomfortable. So thank you very much, Siim. I appreciate you,
Thank you.
and have a good day, man. Hopefully we do this again.
Thank you so much for having me. Enjoy.